Hello everyone, and welcome back. Picture the Netherlands. What comes to mind? Quaint windmills turning gently in the breeze, canals in Amsterdam reflecting gabled houses, or perhaps endless fields of tulips, a vibrant carpet of colour stretching to the horizon. This is the image of the Dutch Golden Age, a time of unparalleled artistic, scientific, and commercial success. It is the story of a small, plucky nation that defied a global empire, embraced tolerance, and created a prosperous republic. But what if I told you that this entire picture, this beautiful, serene painting, is a lie? Or rather, it's a masterpiece painted over a much darker, more violent canvas. What if I told you that beneath the soil of every tulip bulb lies a history watered with blood, and that the world's first multinational corporation was less a business and more a sovereign state of pirates, with its own armies, its own laws, and an insatiable appetite for conquest? This is not the story of windmills and flowers. This is the story of cannons and greed. It's the story of how the Dutch, the supposed champions of liberty, built an empire on blood and fire, pioneering a new, terrifying form. Forget what you think you know about the Dutch Golden Age. Today, we pull back the curtain and expose the brutal truth behind the rise of the Dutch Empire. In the late 16th century, the Netherlands was little more than a soggy collection of provinces, a mudflat clinging to the edge of Europe. They were rebels fighting a desperate 80-year-long war for their very survival against the most powerful force on earth. Its galleons, laden with silver from the New World, dominated the seas. Its armies were the most feared in Europe, and its king, Philip II, was a devout Catholic monarch who saw the Protestant Dutch as heretics to be crushed. The Dutch were cornered. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and on the brink of extinction. Their cities were besieged, their people starved, and yet they refused. They were a nation of merchants, fishermen, and shipbuilders. The sea was in their blood, and if they couldn't defeat Spain on land, they would challenge them on the water. They began as pirates, preying on Spanish shipping, earning the nickname sea beggars. They were a nuisance, a thorn in the side of the Spanish lion, but a thorn can't kill a lion. They needed more. They needed to strike at the heart of Spain's wealth. At the time, the most valuable commodities in the world weren't gold or silver. They were spices: nutmeg, mace, cloves, and pepper, grown in a handful of tiny islands on the other side of the planet. These spices were worth more than their weight in gold in the markets of Europe. They were the key to preserving food, the foundation of medicine, and the ultimate symbol of wealth and status. The Portuguese, and by extension their Spanish masters, they had a monopoly, a stranglehold on the route around Africa to the fabled Spice Islands in the East Indies. The Dutch merchants knew that if they could break this monopoly, they could not only enrich themselves beyond their wildest dreams, but also bankrupt their Spanish enemies. It was an audacious, almost suicidal plan. Small individual Dutch expeditions began to make the perilous journey east. Many ships were, but those that returned, their holds filled with the fragrant scent of cloves and nutmeg, made profits of over 400%. The potential was astronomical, but the competition was fierce, not just from the Portuguese, but among the Dutch themselves. Too many ships sailing east would drive down the price of spices in Amsterdam and drive up the price in Asia. They were cutting their own throats, a brilliant, and up. In 1602, the Dutch government did something unprecedented in human history. They forced all the competing trading companies to merge into one single entity, a mega corporation. They called it the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the VOC, the United East India Company. But this was no mere company. The charter granted by the government gave the VOC powers that no corporation had ever wielded. It could maintain its own private army and navy. It could imprison and execute people, mint its own currency, and wage war on behalf of the Dutch Republic. It was a state within a state, a corporate leviathan, with the sole mandate to achieve a total monopoly on the Asian spice trade, by any means necessary. This wasn't just business. It was warfare disguised as commerce. The directors of the VOC, a shadowy council of 17 men known as the Heren the Sevens, were the new kings of this corporate empire. From their boardroom in Amsterdam, they would move fleets like chess pieces on a global map, deciding the fates of nations they had never seen. Their employees weren't just merchants and sailors, they were soldiers, spies, and administrators, and their goal wasn't just profit. The birth of the Vorsey marked a turning point. The desperate struggle of the sea beggars was over. A new, far more terrifying entity now sailed the seas, a sea monster, born of war and greed, draped in the respectable cloak of a trading company, and its hungry eyes were fixed on a small group of islands, a tropical paradise that held the key to global power, the Banda Islands. If you are finding this untold story of corporate power fascinating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden corners of history. You won't want to miss where this story goes next. The Banda Islands are a tiny, almost invisible archipelago in the vastness of the Indonesian Sea. To the modern eye, they are just dots on a map. But in the 17th century, they were the center of the world. Nutmeg and the lacy red covering around its seed called mace were miraculous commodities. They were rumored to cure the plague. They were powerful aphrodisiacs. They were the flavor that transformed the bland European diet. The demand was insatiable, and the Bandanese people, for centuries, had lived in a peaceful, prosperous trading society. They welcomed merchants from Java, China, and Arabia, trading their precious spice for rice, cloth, and metal goods. They were organized into a collection of villages, governed by councils of elders, known as the Orang Kaya, the rich and powerful men. They understood the value of their unique resource and skillfully played rival traders against each other to get the best prices. They knew no king. Into this paradise, in 1599, sailed the first Dutch ships. At first, the Bandanese welcomed them as they had welcomed others. They saw them as new customers, another player in their bustling market. They signed treaties of friendship and trade. The Dutch, however, did not see the Bandanese as partners. They saw them as an obstacle. The very concept of free trade of the Bandanese. The Heren VII in Amsterdam sent a simple, chilling directive to their men in the East: secure a monopoly on nutmeg and mace, peacefully if possible, but by force if necessary. For the next decade, a tense and bloody dance played out. The Dutch built a fort, Fort Nassau, on the main island. A stone fist clenched in the heart of the Bandanese world. They tried to force the Orang Kaya to sign exclusive contracts, promising to sell nutmeg only to the VOC at a fixed, pitifully low price. The Bandanese resisted. They were traders, not subjects. They continued to sell to their traditional partners, the English, who had followed the Dutch to these lucrative islands and were eager to break their rivals' power. Skirmishes broke out. Dutch admirals were ambushed and killed. The Bandanese fought back with courage and cunning, using their small boats and knowledge of the treacherous reefs to their advantage. But they were facing a new kind of enemy, an enemy that was not a king or a sultan, but an abstract entity, a corporation, an enemy for whom betrayal was a business tactic and violence was a line item on a budget. The profits were not flowing as projected. The English were a constant irritation. The Bandanese were defiant. The situation was unacceptable. The Heren VII decided that a final solution was needed, and they had just the man for the job. His name was Jan Pieterszoon Cohen. Cohen was the embodiment of the Vorsey spirit. He was brilliant, ambitious, and utterly devoid of mirth. He had arrived in the East as a young clerk, and quickly risen through the ranks with his sharp mind and iron will. He saw the world in black and white, Dutch interests and everyone else. To him, the Bandanese were not a people. They were a problem to be solved. The English were not rivals. They were vermin to be exterminated. He had a grand vision for a Dutch trading empire in Asia, a network of forts and trading, and he knew that the foundation of this empire had to be built on absolute terrifying power. He wrote to his directors in Amsterdam, his letters seething with frustration. He complained about their indecisiveness, their half-measures. He laid out his philosophy with chilling clarity. "We cannot carry on trade without war," he wrote, "nor war without trade." He argued that Asian people... He requested more ships, more soldiers, and the authority to act without restraint. In one infamous letter, he declared, "Despair not, spare not your enemies, for God is with us." In 1618, Jan Pieter Cohen was appointed governor, general of the Dutch East Indies. He was now the most powerful man in Asia. He had the full backing of the Walse board. He had his army, he had his fleet. A plan to solve the Banda problem. Once and for all, he would not just conquer the islands. He would erase them, he would wipe the slate clean, and rebuild the nutmeg industry from the ground up, staffed by slaves, managed by Dutchmen for the sole profit of the VOC. It was a plan for systematic extermination, a corporate-sponsored genocide in early 1621. Cohen's fleet appeared on the horizon of the Banda. It was an armada, the likes of which this peaceful corner of the world had never seen. Over a dozen warships, carrying nearly 2,000 Dutch soldiers, supplemented by Japanese mercenaries known for their brutality. The Bandanese watched from their shores, their hearts filled with dread. They knew this was not another trading mission. This was an invasion. Cohen's forces landed on the largest island. They were armed with spears and small cannons. The Dutch had muskets, artillery, and the cold, disciplined tactics of European warfare. The villages were burned, the fields were destroyed. The people fled to the hills, hoping to mount a guerrilla resistance from the dense jungle. Cohen's response was methodical. He divided the island into sections and had his soldiers sweep through them, flushing out the fugitives. He offered an amnesty. He promised the Orinkaya that if they surrendered, their lives and property would be spared. Exhausted, starving, and with their families at risk, 44 of the most important Bandanese leaders accepted the offer and came down from the mountains. It was a trap. Cohen had them arrested immediately. He accused them of conspiring against the Dutch, of breaking treaties they had been forced to sign at gunpoint. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. The 44 leaders were subjected to brutal torture until they confessed to crimes they did not commit. Then they were taken to a public square. Japanese mercenaries, hired for their proficiency with the sword, were tasked with the execution. The leaders were dismembered, their heads and body parts impaled on bamboo stakes and displayed around the island. It was an act of calculated terror, designed to break the will of the Bandanese people completely. But this was only the beginning. With the leadership eliminated, Cohen turned his attention to the rest of the population. He issued an order: kill every Bandanese male over the age of 15. The soldiers, Dutch and Japanese, went on a rampage. They hunted the remaining islanders in the forests. They drove them to the cliffs. They blockaded the islands, preventing escape and causing mass starvation. Mothers killed their own children rather than see them captured. Entire villages committed mass suicide. It was a slaughter, a cold, systematic depopulation. When Cohen's work was done, the Banda Islands were silent. Of a population estimated at around 15,000 people, fewer than 1,000 survived. The original Bandanese people, their culture, their language, their society, had been effectively erased from the face of the earth. In their place, Cohen brought in Dutch planters, known as perkeneers, to manage the nutmeg groves. He repopulated the islands with slaves brought from other parts of Asia. The entire archipelago was transformed into a massive plantation, a corporate slave state, all for a single purpose. Back in Amsterdam, the Heeren the Seventh read Cohen's reports. There was some hand-wringing, some expressed mild disapproval of his methods. But no one could argue with the results. The price of nutmeg in Europe skyrocketed. The VOC's profits soared to unimaginable heights. Jan Pieter Cohen was hailed as a hero. His statue would later be erected in his hometown. He had laid the cornerstone of the Dutch colonial empire, a cornerstone soaked in the blood of an entire people. The wealth that now poured into the Dutch Republic from the east was staggering. It was a river of gold flowing from the ruins of Banda into the coffers of Amsterdam. This wealth, this blood money, fueled what we now call the Dutch Golden Age. It paid for the Grand Canal house. It funded the groundbreaking scientific research of men like Antony van Leeuwenhoek, the father of microbiology. It financed the philosophical inquiries of Spinoza, and it created a booming market for art. Artists like Rembrandt van Rijn and Johannes Vermeer flourished, capturing the world of these newly rich Dutch merchants in breathtaking detail. We look at Rembrandt's masterpiece, The Syndics of the Drapers' Guild, and we see a group of stern, responsible-looking men, the pillars of Dutch society. What we don't see is that their fine black cloth was likely paid for by profits from the VOC. We marvel at Vermeer's The Girl with a Pearl Earring, captivated by her serene beauty. We don't think about the fact that the global trade that brought that pearl to Delft was a trade route carved out by cannons and controlled by fear. The Golden Age was real. The art is magnificent. The scientific breakthroughs were revolutionary. But it was all built on a dark and terrible secret. The prosperity of this small European republic was directly linked to the brutal exploitation of countless people. The Dutch had created a system of global capitalism that was astonishingly modern and ruthlessly efficient. They had financial innovations like the world's first stock market, where shares in the VOC were traded, allowing the public to invest in and profit from their colonial ventures. But this system had a hidden cost, a human cost that was deliberately kept out of the frame of the beautiful paintings. The Dutch applied similar tactics throughout the Indonesian archipelago in Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, to control the cinnamon trade. And elsewhere they fought brutal wars with the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the English, seizing their trading posts and forts. They established a colony in South Africa as a supply station for their ships, dispossessing the native Khoikhoi people. In the West, the Dutch West India Company, a sister to the VOC, became a major player in the transatlantic slave trade, transporting hundreds of thousands of Africans in horrific conditions to work on plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean. They founded a colony called New Netherland in North America, with its capital at New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island, a trading post that would one day become New York City. The Dutch Empire, and at its center was the city of Amsterdam, a glittering hub of finance, art, and intellectual freedom. But it was a freedom paid for by the bondage of others, a prosperity built on plunder. This incredible influx of wealth had another stranger effect on Dutch society. It created a collective madness, a speculative fever that would become one of the most famous and bizarre episodes. If the Banda massacre shows the external brutality of the Dutch enterprise, then this next chapter reveals its internal, irrational soul. While the VOC was busy conquering the East, a different kind of obsession was taking root back home. It didn't involve spices or faraway lands. It involved a flower, the tulip. Tulips were not native to the Netherlands. They were introduced from the Ottoman Empire in the late 16th century and became an instant sensation among the wealthy elite. They were exotic, beautiful, and came in a stunning variety of colors and patterns. Owning rare tulips became the ultimate status symbol, a way for the newly rich merchant class to flaunt their wealth. The most prized tulips were those with broken colors, vibrant flame like streaks on their petals. We know now this was caused by a virus, but at the time it seemed like a beautiful, unpredictable miracle of nature. These unique bulbs could not be reliably reproduced, making them incredibly rare. And in a society awash with new money, rarity created value, and what began as a hobby for botanists and aristocrats soon spiraled into a full-blown financial mania. People from all walks of life were swept up in the frenzy. Merchants, artisans, sailors, even chimney sweeps began trading tulip bulbs. They weren't buying them to plant in their gardens. They were buying them as an investment, certain that the price would continue to rise. A futures market developed where people traded contracts for bulbs that hadn't even been harvested yet. The trade moved from the stock exchange into taverns and back alleys. Prices reached insane levels. A single bulb of a rare variety, like the legendary Semper Augustus or the Viceroy, could be sold for the price of a large townhouse in Amsterdam. People traded their life savings, their land. It was a bubble of epic proportions, detached from any rational sense of value. The same national character that drove the Dutch to meticulously plan the conquest of the Spice Islands was now being applied to this frantic, irrational gamble. The ambition, the risk, taking the single-minded pursuit of profit that defined the Vos had come home to roost, but in a strange, distorted form. Then inevitably the bubble burst. In February 1637, for reasons that are still debated, the market suddenly collapsed. Perhaps a few smart investors decided to cash out. Perhaps a default on a single contract caused a panic. Whatever the trigger, confidence evaporated overnight. Everyone tried to sell at once, and there were no buyers. Prices plummeted. Fortunes were wiped out the great Dutch tulip mania was over, leaving a trail of bankruptcy and bitter recriminations. Many see tulip mania as a cautionary tale about the madness of crowds and the dangers of speculative bubbles. But it is also a mirror. It reflects the Dutch Golden Age in all its glory and contradiction. It shows a society so flush with cash, so confident in its own prosperity, that it could convince itself a flower was worth more than a house. The wealth that made this madness possible was the same wealth extracted through the brutal efficiency of the Vootel. The speculative fever that gripped the tulip traders was a domestic echo of the high-stakes gambles being made by men like Cohen in the East. Both were driven by a relentless desire for more, a belief that fortune favored the bold. One venture ended in a financial crash, the other ended in genocide together. They paint a portrait of a nation at the peak of its power, brilliant and innovative, yet also reckless and rapacious. A nation that could produce both the sublime beauty of a Vermeer painting and the calculated horror of the Banda massacre. The Dutch Empire was a paradox, a marvel of modernity built on the most ancient of sins, but an empire built on such aggressive foundations cannot remain unchallenged forever. The very success of the Dutch attracted powerful enemies. The English, in particular, looked at the Dutch model with a mixture of envy and outrage. They had been humiliated by the Dutch in the Spice Islands, most notably in the Amboina massacre of 1623, where VOC officials tortured and executed English merchants on trumped-up charges. The English decided to copy the Dutch model, creating their own powerful East India Company. They also challenged Dutch dominance at sea directly. A series of brutal Anglo-Dutch wars. These were not wars of kings and dynasties. They were wars of trade, fought by massive naval fleets for control of global sea lanes. The Dutch, with legendary admirals like Michel de Ruyter, won many stunning victories. But the wars were ruinously expensive. England was a larger nation, with more resources and a growing ambition to build its own global empire. At the same time, the rising power of France under King Louis XIV began to threaten the Netherlands on the European continent. The Dutch found themselves fighting on multiple fronts, at sea and on land. The tiny republic was being squeezed by giants. The VOC itself, once a lean and efficient machine of profit, began to suffer from corruption and bloat. Its officials in the East lived like the costs of maintaining its vast network of forts and its massive military machine began to outweigh its income. The spice monopoly, once the bedrock of its wealth, became less important as spices became more widely cultivated, and new commodities like tea, coffee, and textiles grew in importance. The world the Dutch had created was changing, and they were struggling to keep up. The 18th century saw Amsterdam was still a rich city, but London was becoming the new center of global finance and trade. The final blow came at the end of the century. The French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte swept across Europe. The Dutch Republic was invaded and overthrown, replaced by a puppet state. In 1799, the Verenigde Ostindische Compagnie, the once mighty Volk, the sea monster that had terrorized the East for 2 centuries, was declared bankrupt and officially dissolved. Its territories were taken over by the Dutch state, becoming the formal colony of the Dutch East Indies. The corporate empire was dead. So, we return to our original question. The answer, of course, is both. The tulips and the cannons were 2 sides of the same coin. The beauty and the brutality were inextricably linked. The Dutch Golden Age was a period of incredible achievement. It gave the world revolutionary ideas in art, science, law, and finance. It proved that a small republic could stand up to mighty empires and thrive. But this legacy is forever stained. It is a legacy financed by the slave trade. It's a legacy of a corporate entity that acted with the impunity of a state, pioneering a form of colonialism so brutally efficient that other European powers would spend the next 2 centuries copying it. The story of the Dutch Empire forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What is the true cost of progress? How much violence and exploitation are we willing to over? The ghosts of Jan Pieter Cohen and the people he slaughtered still haunt our modern world. The idea that a corporation's only responsibility is to its shareholders, regardless of the human cost, is a direct descendant of the Vosges Charter. The global supply chains that bring us our coffee, our clothes, our technology often hide stories of exploitation that are not so different from those of the 17th century. Statues of men like Cohen are now sites of protest. Museums are re-evaluating how they tell the story of the Golden Age. It is a painful but necessary reckoning. The story is not as simple as good versus evil. It's a story of human beings capable of creating breathtaking beauty and committing unimaginable cruelty. Often at the same time, it's a reminder that behind every great fortune and every gold... That is all for today's video. This was a dark and complex story, and we've only scratched the surface. If you found this journey into the shadows of history compelling, please show your support by hitting the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories that challenge the official narrative. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.